I have to change just one setting on our YouTube and we will be ready to go. Okay, I'm all ready whenever you are, Jim.
Okay, thank you. And good evening, everybody. It is now 5:30 on December 14, 2022. We have a busy City of Salem hearings officer agenda tonight, our end of the year meeting. On the agenda this evening, we have 3 hearings. We have signed conditional use sign permit case number CU-SI 22-06, conditional use class 2 adjustment case number CU-ADJ 2204, and conditional use subdivision tentative plan class 2 adjustment, class 2 driveway approach permit, case number CU SUB ADJ DAP 22-05. I'm trying to kill a little bit of time because we know that there are some more people who will be joining us. But I also want to be respectful of everyone's time this evening. I will be going. My name is Jim Brewer. I am the hearings officer for the City of Salem. I'll be conducting the hearings and making the decisions on these 3 cases. My general practice is to go through the procedural things with each case kind of in order. I think we'll do these in order. My initial thought was, I know the second case, which involves the property at 795 Church Street Southeast, has a lot of public interest. I gave some thought to moving things around, but I understand people are still signing in or planning on signing in a little later, and I don't want to surprise people if we take things out of order. So with that, I think that we will go ahead and start with the signed conditional use sign permit case number CU-SI 22-06. And I will go through the order of proceedings for that case as I will for each of the other cases this evening. So the hearing is conducted virtually, as everyone knows. We'll do things in a particular order. Because this is a virtual case, testimony from neighborhood associations and people in favor or in opposition are going to be limited to those who signed in before 3:00 p.m. For this first case, I don't believe anybody signed in other than the applicant. The order of tonight's proceedings will be a staff report. I believe that'll be presented by Jamie Donaldson from the city. We'll have time for an applicant's presentation. That'll be limited to 15 minutes. A neighborhood report, if there is any. I don't think there is one in this case. That will be limited to 10 minutes. And then we'll take the testimony of people who've signed in, again, before 3:00 today. And we'd ask each person who testifies to give their name and their address so that the recording picks it up. And the order that we'll do that kind of public testimony is we'll take testimony in favor of the applicant, and we'll limit that to 5 minutes per person. Testimony in opposition, again, limited to 5 minutes per person. Testimony that's neutral, limited to 5 minutes. Then we would do rebuttal by the applicant that's limited in scope to issues raised in opposition, and the applicant will get 5 minutes to do that. And then the public hearing typically will close. I want to direct everyone's attention to the applicable criteria found in the notice. The testimony and the evidence for the public hearing should be directed towards these criteria because that's really what I'm supposed to consider in making this decision. So this is an electronic display sign conditional use permit. SRC chapter 900.045 sub D states that an application for an electronic display sign conditional use permit shall be granted if the following criteria are met. 1, the sign will not create or significantly increase street level sign clutter. 2, the sign will not adversely impact the neat, clean, orderly, and attractive appearance of the surrounding vicinity to a significant degree. 3, the sign will not create a traffic or safety hazard. And 4, the sign complies with all the other standards in this chapter, including but not limited to height and placement standards. There's a sign permit portion 2. SRC 900.025 sub D states that an application for sign permit shall be granted if the following criteria are met. 1, the sign meets the requirements of SRC chapter 56. 2, the sign is allowed in the zone. 3, the sign will not interfere with the use of any public right-of-way, other public easements, or other publicly owned property. 4, the sign conforms to all the applicable standards in this chapter. This is a time when I'm supposed to tell people failure to raise an issue accompanied by statements or evidence sufficient to afford the city or other parties the opportunity to respond to the issue precludes appeals to the State Land Use Board of Appeals based on that issue. So if there's a point someone wants to make, this is the time and place to do it, or you may not be able to later. Failure of the applicant to raise constitutional or other issues related to proposed conditions of approval with sufficient specificity to allow the local government or its designee to respond to the issue precludes an action for damages in circuit court. To people who are listening this evening, have a kind of generalized question. Are there any objections on jurisdictional grounds on the holding of this hearing? Meaning this isn't the kind of hearing that's supposed to be in front of the hearings officer. I'm not seeing anybody come on, and I'm not seeing anything from Zachary indicating someone wants to talk. This is CU-SI 22-06 550 Reed Lane Southeast. Could we have the staff report, Ms. Donaldson?
Yes, thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay, good evening. I'm Jamie Donaldson, case manager for the sign conditional use and sign permit case number 22-06. I would like to introduce the staff report and its attachments and this presentation into the record.
And they will be so entered. Thank you.
Thank you. The applicant is requesting a conditional use permit and sign permit application to remove an existing backlit reader board sign, a monument sign at Pringle Elementary School, and replace it with an electronic display wall sign on a new building for the school. The conditional use approval is required because the property is zoned RA residential agriculture, and an electronic reader board requires approval of a conditional use sign permit when located in a single family zone. Properties in the area are zoned residential and are developed with single family dwellings, an elementary school, and a park. Here we have an aerial of Pringle Elementary School showing a construction area where the new building and proposed electronic reader board will be, which will replace the existing sign near Reed Lane. The existing sign is a monument reader board sign seen here, located near the driveway entrance of the school along the west property line abutting Reed Lane Southeast. The proposal is to replace the existing sign near the street with an electronic reader board mounted on the wall of a new interior building for the school, which is part of the school's recent expansion. The applicant stated that the impacts on the surrounding residential areas will be minimized because the sign will be set at an angle and shielded from the adjacent road by several trees located on site between the school and the houses to the west, represented here in green. The location of the sign and the screening provided by the surrounding trees reduces the visibility from residential properties across the street from the school and even to the south of the school. A close-up of the area shows that the proposed electronic reader board would be located approximately 168 feet from the street right of way, much further from the street than the existing sign, which has been conditioned to be removed as part of this approval. The proposed electronic reader board would be approximately 24 square feet and 11 feet above grade. This is smaller than the maximum allowable display area of 32 square feet allowed for a school in the RA zone. Photo shows a street view looking northeast with the existing reader board there in the front. and the approximate location of the school's new building with the electronic reader board sign further back. Here we have a view along Reed Lane looking south with the existing sign to be removed there in the distance. City departments, public agencies, and the South Gateway Neighborhood Association had no comments on the proposal. Staff finds that the proposed sign meets all the criteria for a conditional use sign permit, as it will not increase street level sign clutter, is shielded from view of the nearest dwellings by several trees, and will not cause traffic or safety hazards due to the distance of the sign located from the street, and meets all other sign regulations under the Salem Revised Code, Chapter 900. Size and location requirements for electronic display signs within residential zones are found to be met, and therefore staff recommends approval of the application with the condition of approval as outlined. And that concludes the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, I really have one question, and it may be in the staff report, and maybe I just didn't see it. Does the existing sign also have a conditional use approval?
It does not.
And that my follow-up question would have been, well, what were those conditions, and are they something that we need to address? Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And would the applicant like to make a presentation? And I'll remind everybody that the applicant has the burden of proof to show the approval criteria can be satisfied by the facts. Opponents can rebut the applicant's testimony by showing alternate facts or by showing the evidence submitted does not satisfy the approval criteria.
Good evening. My name is Margaret Gandervo. I am the attorney for the applicant, the Salem-Keizer School District. My address for notice purposes is 250 Church Street, Southeast, Suite 200, Salem, Oregon, 97301. As you mentioned, we're going to keep this presentation pretty brief. The criteria are pretty straightforward, and applicant has provided sufficient findings in the record regarding all of the applicable approval criteria. We'd like to thank Jamie for her time and effort on the staff report and presentation, and want to follow up with just a couple of additional comments regarding these types of signs. As mentioned regarding the sign permit approval criteria, there are automatic dimming mechanisms within this sign that further help minimize the impact on the surrounding areas. And this particular property has quite a bit of screening from the adjacent residential uses, which help minimize both the safety and the aesthetic concerns that the conditional use permit process is designed to mitigate in these circumstances. This is a pretty standard sign used by the district on quite a few other properties. It is just by virtue of the zoning that we're required to get a conditional use permit for this particular sign. We have a couple of representatives from the district here who aren't intending to testify, just because we want to be respectful of everyone's time and understanding that the docket is pretty full this evening, but we're happy to answer any questions that you might have of us. And we, again, want to thank Jamie for her time and effort on this.
I think that I have seen a couple of other conditional use sign permits with similar signs for other school purposes. So I'm familiar with those. And I do think that the information staff report and the application is very helpful in this matter. I don't really have any other questions for you. I think if you'd hang on briefly, because you should get an opportunity to rebut, but I don't believe anybody else has signed up. Is that correct, Zachary?
That is correct. We don't have anyone signed up for testimony for this case. I think technically, if someone who's currently present wanted to provide testimony, they would be allowed to, but no one signed up for this case.
If someone would like to, they could unmute themselves, I guess, but I'm not seeing any takers on that. With that, then what I'm going to do is close the hearing. It'll probably take me a week or so to get a decision out on this. But I tend to agree with the staff report, meets the criteria. And I think that decision will be forthcoming. Thank you. And with that, this case is closed.
Jim, I just want to double check. Do you have to ask the applicant if they want the record to remain open for any reason?
You do have that last word. You've got an opportunity for an additional 7 days to permit to provide additional written argument if you would like.
We don't think that's necessary in this case. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate the brevity on this matter. And thank you, Ms. Donaldson, as well. With that, I think we'll move on to the next hearing. So do we have everybody you were expecting at this point, Zachary?
We are still missing two who had signed up, but I will admit them if they show up.
Okay, I think that we've to respect everybody's time, we'll go ahead and as I said, my practice is to go through the procedural things for each hearing. We will now go to the second hearing this evening, which is CU ADJ 22-04. And it is now 5:46 p.m. I'm still Jim Brewer. I'm still the City of Salem's hearings officer. I'm going to go through the hearing procedures because this hearing is conducted virtually. Testimony from neighborhood organizations and persons in favor or in opposition. It's going to be limited to those who signed in before 3 p.m. And I know that we are expecting a couple more people to sign in. The order of tonight's proceedings will be a staff report to be presented in this case by Bryce Bishop. The applicant's presentation, that'll be limited to 15 minutes. A neighborhood report, if any, and we will limit that to 10 minutes. Testimony of those who signed in before 3 o'clock today. And again, I'd ask people to give their name and address so the recording picks it up. And we'll go in the following order: testimony in favor of the application, limited to 5 minutes per person. Testimony in opposition to the application, limited to 5 minutes per person. Testimony that's neutral, limited to 5 minutes. And then we'll go to rebuttal by the applicant, limited in scope to issues raised in opposition. And at that point, what I will say is we've already had a request to hold the record open, and we'll discuss the calendaring of that a little later in the hearing. But that does mean that there won't be a decision at all tonight, and that additional information will be allowed to come in. The record is going to be held open. I do want to direct everyone's attention to the applicable criteria that are found in the notice. The testimony and the evidence for this public hearing should be directed towards these criteria because that's what I'm supposed to make my decision on. So there's a conditional use permit and class 2 adjustment, and this is to allow a single family dwelling to be used as a short-term rental at 795 Church Street Southeast. For the conditional use permit, SRC Chapter 240.005 sub D states that an application for conditional use permit shall be granted if all the following criteria are met. 1, the proposed use is allowed as a conditional use in the zone. 2, the reasonably likely adverse impacts of the use on the immediate neighborhood can be minimized through the imposition of conditions. And 3, the proposed use will be reasonably compatible with and have minimal impact on the livability or appropriate development of surrounding property. For the class 2 adjustment, SRC 250.005 sub D sub 2 states that an application for a class 2 adjustment should be granted if all of the following criteria are met. A, the purpose underlying the specific development standard proposed for the adjustment is sub I, clearly applicable to the proposed development, or sub 2, equally or better met by the proposed development. B, if located within a residential zone, the proposed development will not detract from the livability or appearance of the residential area. C, if more than one adjustment has been requested, the cumulative effect of all of the adjustments result in a project which is still consistent with the overall purpose of the zone. This is now the time when I need to remind people who are going to testify tonight or going to provide additional written information that failure to raise an issue accompanied by statements or evidence sufficient to afford the city or other parties the opportunities to respond to the issue precludes appeal to the State Land Use Board of Appeals based on that issue. So if you have a point that you want to make, this is the time and place to make it, or you may not be able to at a later date. Failure of the applicant to raise constitutional or other issues relating to proposed conditions of approval with sufficient specificity to allow the local government or its designee to respond to the issue precludes an action for damages in circuit court. So if there's a problem with the conditions, this is the time for the applicant to raise issues with those. For everybody who's here, I do have a kind of generalized question, which is, are there any objections on jurisdictional grounds on the holding of the hearing? Meaning that this isn't the sort of thing that ought to be in front of a hearings officer. I'm not seeing anybody raise an objection. If you do have one, you can do it during your testimony as well. So this is CU-ADJ 22-04, 795 Church Street Southeast, Salem, Oregon, 97301. Could we have the staff report, Mr. Bishop?
Yes, Mr. Brewer, thank you very much. My name is Bryce Bishop, and I am planner with the Community Development Department Planning Division, and I am here tonight to present the staff report, or as the hearings officer mentioned, conditional use permit and a Class 2 adjustment for a property located at 795 Church Street Southeast. So in terms of application background, there are two components, as has been referenced. One is the conditional use permit, and in the RS zone, which the property is zoned, short-term rentals, such as those for Airbnb or VRBO or any of those other short-term rental platforms, they require a conditional use permit if the operator and owner will not be residing, on the in the unit that's being rented. There is another type of short-term rental that's referred to as an accessory short-term rental that you'll see in some of the testimony that was referenced. The neighborhood association and neighbors are supportive of that type of rental. And an accessory short-term rental is where the owner and operator lives in the dwelling unit that's being rented. In this case, because the applicant and applicants and operators, are local in Salem, but they won't be living in the unit that's being rented, it requires a conditional use permit, and that's required for that component. And then the second component is a Class 2 adjustment that's needed to address two of the parking spaces that are being provided to meet the proposed short-term rentals minimum off-street parking requirement. They're in an existing driveway, and because of the deficient right-of-way width of Mission Street currently to meet its required width under the city's transportation system plan, there is a special setback that applies along the property, and the two spaces in the driveway that are being used to meet the required off-street parking will be in that special setback or in that special setback area. So in terms of application processing, the application was deemed complete on November 22nd. Mailed notice was subsequently provided on November 23rd. Notice was posted on the property by the applicant on December 1st, and then the state mandated local decision deadline for the case is March 22nd of next year. So in terms of the context of the area and where the property is located, you can see on the aerial photo here, we can have a large area kind of South Salem, or this area of Salem south of the downtown. And so the property is marked by the white asterisk, and then it is on Mission Street at the corner of Church Street. So right here, the green shaded area is the Gaiety Hill Bushes Pasture Park Historic District. So it is within that historic district. And then you have the Liberty and Commercial Couplet Street to the west. You also have Salem Hospital across Church Street from the property to the east. You have Bush Pasture Park across Mission Street from the property to the south. And then for reference, to the northwest, short distance is this City Hall and library. So in terms of the comprehensive plan and zoning that apply to the property, the property and surrounding properties in the historic district are designated single-family residential on the city's comprehensive plan map, and they're zoned single-family residential RS. And as previously mentioned, this property is within the historic district and at the corner of Church and Mission Street. As you'll see in testimony, in the written testimony that was provided, there was reference to a previous conditional use permit for a short-term rental that received approval back in 2018. And that was for a property at 725 High Street, which is, a block to the west. one house in from the corner of Leslie and High Street. So that's marked by the star here. So the first one was approved in 2018 through the conditional use process, and this would be the second one that's been proposed in the Gady Hill Bush Pasture Park Historic District. So in terms of site conditions, the property is approximately 6,900 square feet in size. And it is, developed with a historic contributing home, the Brazier C Small House. The house is approximately 2,713 square feet and with a 1,320 square foot basement. It has 4 bedrooms and it's 2 stories with the basement. There is the existing driveway and a portion of an existing parking pad that are located on the property. And as previously mentioned, Mission Street, it's a minor arterial, and a minor arterial requires 72 feet of right-of-way, but the right-of-way width of Mission Street is only 60 feet. So there is a 12-foot deficiency in the required right-of-way for Mission Street. And whenever there is a property that abuts a street that doesn't have sufficient right-of-way, the city has what's called a special setback that applies. And what the special setback does, it reserves the area within that needed future right-of-way area for future dedication, essentially. And so you can't place any structures in that setback area. You can't have required parking within that special setback area. And then any setback for like the structures on lots is based on not the property line, but it's measured from the special setback line. And the whole idea is that when anything occurs new on the property, that we're not approving something that is non-conforming and that would have to be removed or made non-conforming if right-of-way were to be acquired in the future for a widening. But in this case, there are 2 existing spaces in the driveway that would be needed to meet the developments or the proposed uses off-street parking requirement will be in that special setback area. So if the road were to ever be widened, those 2 spaces would essentially have to go away because there wouldn't be a sufficient depth to accommodate those, and therefore there'd be 2 fewer spaces on the lot. And so the applicants have requested an adjustment to allow those 2 spaces to encroach. And as you'll see later in this decision, there are conditions that staff is recommending to ensure that if Mission Street were to be widened at any point in the future, there would need to be changes to how the existing home would be occupied in order to make sure the parking that's required to meet the use's needs and requirements under the code would be otherwise met after the widening. So in terms of context, in terms of what the property looks like on the ground, here is a view facing or view looking west from Church Street, kind of to the front door of the house. So it is on the corner of Bush and Mission. And then there are other historic homes in the district to the right or to the north of this property. Here's a view facing north from, and I think, sorry, that was Church Street. I think I might have said Mission. So the other one is the view from Church Street facing west to the front of the house. This is a view facing north from Mission Street. This shows the side of the house with the existing garage, the existing driveway, the existing, paved pad that's been there for some time, since somewhere between 2005 and 2008. And so that's the side view of the house. And then to the west or to the left, there are other homes within the historic district. And then to the east, you'll see across Church Street is a rehabilitation center from Salem Hospital, for Salem Hospital. And then here's another view near the intersection of Church and Mission. And the home is on the corner. And then the kind of the playground area that's associated with the rehabilitation center that Salem Hospital installed. And then here's a view from Church Street looking kind of to the southwest. There's an alley, short distance to the north that doesn't serve this property, but then you have a historic home, the house on the corner. And so that's kind of and then Bush Pasture Park off in the distance to the south. And then one final view looking on Mission Street, looking east or kind of northeast towards the house at the corners behind that tree there, to kind of get a feel for what the street looks like along the frontage of Mission Street as you go along there. Okay, so in terms of the site plan, its existing house is proposed to be utilized as a short-term rental. There are no proposed, additions or changes to the house in order to accommodate the proposed short-term rental. and they're proposing to provide 4 off-street parking spaces to serve the use. 1 space would be in the existing garage, 2 spaces would be within the existing driveway, and then 1 space would be proposed in the northern portion of the parking pad in the side yard between the house and Mission Street. The minimum parking requirement is 1 space per guest room, and since there are 4 guest rooms that will be available to rent, within this home, 4 spaces is the minimum off-street parking requirement. On the site plan here in pink, you see the vision clearance triangle that the applicant has identified for stop controlled intersections. It's 10 feet in depth by 50 feet in length along the street. And so, as you can see, any kind of, parking area in the pad to the north with the fence that will be required will be outside the vision clearance area and in conformance with the code. And again, when you look at the 12-foot special setback and how that comes into play, if Mission Street were to ever be widened, the sidewalk would go from its existing location, up to the north to be next to the property line, and then this area of the existing paved slab would be wiped out and could not be used for parking, and the applicant is not proposing to use that for parking. And there is a condition to deal with this existing slab that's being recommended that I'll discuss later. But that when that 12-foot setback comes into play, you now have 2 spaces in a driveway that wouldn't be of sufficient depth to accommodate car parking in them without hanging over into the right of way, and it'd be left with 2 spaces. So there is a condition that has been recommended to mitigate that, so if there's only 2 spaces left on the site after a widening, that the use on the property would have to be changed to accommodate, having only 2 spaces available. So as identified in the staff report, staff has looked at the applicant statement, and we've reviewed the criteria, and we believe that it does meet all applicable criteria, and we're recommending approval with conditions. The use is allowed as a conditional use in the zone. With the conditions, the 6 conditions that are identified below, we believe those conditions are adequate to minimize any reasonably likely adverse impacts of the use on surrounding properties in the surrounding area. And even though the use is not a residential use where people will be living there long term, it will be a use where people will be staying on a short-term basis in a residential dwelling that will not have an appearance that's any different than what you'll see today in the historic district. It'll stay that way, and any changes have to go through historic design review. So it will still be reasonably compatible with and not have impacts on the surrounding property. And so the 6 conditions for the conditional use permit that we're recommending are 1, limiting the occupancy of the building to no more than 8 people, and that's essentially 2 guests per guest room. So 4 guest rooms times 2 would be 8. And then as we allow in the code for accessory short-term rentals, we do not count children under a certain age. So children under 12 will not be counted towards the 8-person max limit. It can only be rented to 1 group of guests at a time. We do not want to have situations where you have a home being rented by groups of strangers. That is not a great thing, and that's a limit that we have for accessory short-term rentals that are allowed as a special use in this zone. And so, in order to minimize impacts and to have a use of the property that would be consistent with what otherwise would be allowed as an accessory short-term rental, we're recommending that condition. And then also a limit that it has to be only used for lodging. It can't be used for events, parties, gatherings, banquets, or anything like that that's other than just staying there for overnight lodging accommodations. Bike spaces are shown as being proposed on the site plan, but those bike spaces will need to be provided in conformance with Chapter 806, 060, which is the section of our off-street parking chapter that deals with bike parking in terms of location and the types of racks. And there's a minimum of 4 bike spaces that are required for proposed use. And then a requirement that the existing paved area to the south of the existing building, the southern portion of that has to be removed. That's within the special setback because that does not conform to the code. And then the remaining northern portion of the parking slab has to be screened to meet our minimum screening requirements residential properties in a side yard abutting a street by a 6-foot side obscuring fence. And that fence, the 6-foot height standard, is consistent with what is allowed or required for properties within the historic district in a side yard on a secondary facade or next to a secondary facade. And then finally, a condition that limits the transferability of the conditional use permit from one owner to another. So generally, conditional use permits, once they're approved, they do run with the land under our code. But because the operation of a short-term rental impacts could vary based on the operator. We've consistently established a condition for all conditional use permits for this type of use in residential neighborhoods that, unlike other conditional use permits where the approval runs with the land regardless who owns it. So if you got a conditional use permit as the owner for your property and then you sold it, the next owner could take advantage and utilize that same approval. Condition 6 specifically prohibits that. And so if the current applicants and owners were to ever sell the property in the future and a new owner would want to operate a conditional or a short-term rental in the structure like had been, they wouldn't be able to do that under that existing previous conditional use permit. They'd have to come in and go through the process for a new one.
Okay.
And then I talked about the class 2 adjustment already. You have Mission Street, which is a minor arterial requiring 72 feet of right-of-way width. There's only 60 feet existing, so therefore a 12-foot special setback that essentially would wipe out, the 2 spaces in the driveway if Mission Street is ever widened, leaving only 2 spaces on the property. In order to address that, we have recommended a condition that if Mission Street is widened and they needed to acquire the full 72 foot of width, or 36 Half Street right of way width from the center line, they would have to, and they can't have a minimum 20-foot driveway in front of the existing garage. So if the widening is such that they need all the area, which would result in a driveway of 20 feet not being able to be provided, then the applicant has to either change the use back to a single family dwelling or reduce the number of guest rooms in the short-term rental from the 4 that would be currently proposed to 2, and then a corresponding reduction of the maximum number of guests allowed from 8 down to 4. And so because those 2 spaces would be eliminated with a widening of Mission Street, leaving only 2 spaces, if the residence were to be converted back to or if the structure were to be converted back to the use of as a single family dwelling, the minimum off-street parking for a single family dwelling is 2. So they'd have 1 in the driveway, 1 in the screened parking area to meet their minimum off-street parking requirement. Or they could, just reduce the number of guest rooms that were rented out to 2, and that would, have again minimum 1 space per guest room, 2 spaces being required, so they could meet their parking requirement that way. So even though the adjustment would allow them to operate with 4, in the interim, and at any time when Mission Street is widened, they will have to change their operation to ensure that the amount of parking spaces provided on site is equal to the amount that's required under the code for the specific use. So we feel that minimizes the impacts and equally or better meets the intent of the standard of the special setback, because the idea behind the special setback is that we do not want things to be occurring in that area that result in nonconformities that, essentially, I don't want to say take the property rights, but if you have a development, if this was approved without an adjustment and the requirement is for 4 spaces, to be provided, and we widen, and there's nothing that says that they would have to change their operation to reflect the loss of parking, they would be able to say, well, city, you approved us as at four guest rooms, we needed to have 4 spaces, and now you're coming and saying you're going to take 2 away. You're making our business, you're going to make us non-conforming. And so it opens us up to things that, in terms of creating non-conformance and how do we address that, down the road. So this condition, maintains the intent by ensuring that non-conforming development isn't created, but in the meantime, until Mission Street is widened, if it ever is widened, there's no no project on the horizon to widen it. And quite frankly, a widening of Mission Street would have a big impact on the properties, not only this property, but properties, along Mission Street to the west as well, because there'd be 12 feet of additional right of way that'd be required. Long story short, don't know when it would happen, but if it ever does happen, we have a means to make sure that we're not creating non-conforming development. So there were comments that were received from the neighborhood association and the public. The SCAN board, the properties within the South Central Association of Neighbors or SCAN Neighborhood Association. As you see in the comments provided from SCAN, their board voted unanimously to recommend that the hearings officer not approve the conditional use permit and deny it. In the comments provided, the main concerns identified were that the use represents a commercialization of a single-family residence in a residential historic district, and that the commercial use conflicts with the goal of the historic district when it was originally established. The short-term rental occupancy of a single-family dwelling does not increase or stimulate increased owner occupancy or stabilize the neighborhood. It will have impact on the livability of surrounding property. That every home converted to a short-term rental takes a home away from a neighbor or potentially an active community member. And the impact of converting single-family dwellings to short-term rentals, what kind of impact that has on the city's supply of affordable housing. And then in addition to that, prior to the staff report being completed, there were 28 comments that were submitted from area property owners and concerned citizens. Those were included, in the staff report as attachments. There were a few additional comments that came in after the public, that the staff report was made available to the public. Those are in the record and they've been transmitted to the hearings officer for his consideration. And, kind of to summarize those issues, they're very similar to the issues that were raised in SCAN's comments. And it's about impact of the proposed non-residential use on the character of the residential historic district, the impacts of having, parking. In some of the testimony, it was indicated that they thought that there was going to be an expansion of parking to accommodate 5 spaces. So there was a little bit of confusion on that. Concerns about vehicle and pedestrian safety, the proposed commercial use not being consistent with the historic district, and impact on housing supply. So very similar comments. So in terms of response to those comments, the first one, the main category is, the impact on the character of the residential historic district. The home will still be used as a place for individuals to stay, though they won't be living there long term. People will be, staying in a single family home on a short-term basis. It'll maintain its appearance as a single family home. It'll be limited in terms of how many guests can be there. And it'll have a number of cars parked in the driveway, 4 that's not uncommon to see in a residential district. And then the city's historic preservation ordinance, which is under chapter 230, it doesn't preclude, specific uses. The main driver in terms of what is allowed on a property or not is the underlying zoning. Where chapter 230 comes into play is what is done on the property in terms of physical improvements and changes to the site in terms of building additions, windows, changing of roofing material. So it's all about the outward appearance and on the property and how it relates to other properties in the historic district, and not necessarily, it doesn't get into the use of the land. It's that's left to the underlying zone. And then there are conditions as I previously indicated, that will ensure that the proposed short-term rental will operate consistently as what would be required for an accessory short-term rental in terms of the maximum number of guests, that it has to be used only for lodging, and that it can only be used for one, group of occupants at a time or renters at a time. And then I would like to just quickly mention that just because you have a home that is being used as a short-term rental as opposed to a long-term owner-occupied or rented dwelling does not necessarily mean that you'll always have neighborly interactions, amongst the folks that are in the area. There could very well be situations where you have, owners of adjacent properties that don't get along and aren't neighborly. And so just because, something is going to be occupied by a renter on a short-term basis, through more of a transient occupancy like a hotel or motel, doesn't mean that you can't have necessarily good interactions with those individuals who are visiting and are maybe excited to visit the city and kind of get a feel for its character and flavor. So just because they're not owner occupied doesn't mean that you can have good interactions. And if they are, and it doesn't mean that all owner occupied residences, all the residents get along, and it's a great place either. So that's a little bit of a gray area, in terms of how people interact with each other, and it's a kind of a social issue. In terms of parking, no additional paving is proposed. Paving is going to actually be removed. That southern half of the paved slab between the house and Mission Street there's a condition 5A that requires its removal and replacement with landscaping or grass, to restore it to its more original appearance. Only 4 off-street parking spaces are proposed. That's the minimum off-street parking requirement. So they're not like trying to overpark and really trying to cram a bunch of cars onto the property. The number of spaces that are going to be provided in that area are consistent with what you'd see in surrounding single-family neighborhoods or single-family developments. It's 4 spaces, and then the recommended limit on the number of guests helps to minimize potential parking impacts. In terms of impacts on housing supply, there have been a lot of changes at the state level and in the city's development code in terms of how we review and approve developments, especially with the approval of House Bill 2001 by the state and our recent incorporation of those changes into our local code that requires cities to allow middle housing or duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and townhouses in any residential zone in the city. There are some limitations, but you can have a duplex on any single family zoned lot that's 4,000 or greater, just like a single family home. A triplex can be built on a 5,000 square foot lot, and a fourplex could be built on a 7,000 square foot lot. So with the recent changes to our code and the allowance of accessory dwelling units and improvements or streamlining of our multifamily design standards and development process, it's much easier now to have a diversity of housing types in single family residential areas. So any impact that you might see from the occasional conversion of a short-term rental or a single family dwelling to a short-term rental, this will likely be overshadowed by all the middle housing development applications that will now be possible for increased residential density in single family zones. And I would also like to mention when we wrote the standards for short-term rentals several years ago, we looked at how we wanted to allow them. And there was consideration, well, should we allow them in duplexes or multifamily? And there was a legitimate and a specific concern about not allowing them in duplexes and multifamily developments to minimize the impact on housing supply, because you see across the nation where some people choose to convert multifamily developments to short-term rentals and essentially making them hotels, but we chose not to allow them in multifamily and duplexes, and specifically limit short-term rentals to single-family dwellings. So the type of housing, and you also cannot have them in accessory dwelling units either. So the where you can do these is limited, and so the limits on our housing supply, we feel are could be minimal. And then finally, the commercialization of the historic district. Again, it's the property's underlying RS zone that establishes which uses are allowed, not the Chapter 230 or the Historic Preservation Ordinance. Short-term rentals, were identified and allowed as an allowed use through the conditional use process in the RS zone. So it can be there through this process. And it's not a commercial use in terms of an office or retail or other kind of business use that you might think of when you hear it's a commercial business. They're not looking to put in a big parking lot on the property or do anything new on the site. It's just to allow the existing single family dwelling to be used as a place for individuals to stay on a short-term basis. And the proposal is consistent with the city's historic preservation ordinance. Anything that will occur on the property or anything that the applicant proposes to do in the future in terms of changes to the appearance of the structure or the site will have to go through historic design review approval with the Landmarks Commission. And there are no changes that are required to be made to the home in order to accommodate the proposed use. And oh gosh, sorry, I'm really running long here. Sorry about that, everybody. And then kind of just to say, a redundant slide here. So Chapter 230 is just limited to, designation of historic resources, historic design review for the physical appearance of developments that, whenever you want to remove a historic resource that requires a demolition review through the Landmarks Commission. And if you want to, use a, property that for a use that's not otherwise allowed in the zone through a historic adaptive reuse, that's an allowed process as well. But again, they don't look at what, they don't look at, the Landmarks Commission does not look at conditional use permits, and they are not looking at use itself. It's just how the development, appears and how changes to the development meet the integrity of the district and comply and conform and are harmonious with the standards for historic preservation included in Chapter 230. So based on all of those findings in the staff report, staff recommends that the conditional use permit and the Class 2 adjustment be approved with the conditions recommended. Thank you.
Okay, I have a couple of questions and maybe some housekeeping. So we're going to enter the presentation, the staff report, the additional written testimony or evidence that people submitted before the hearing, but that are not attached to the staff report. All of those go into the record. And I've got 4 pieces that I've received outside of the ones that are attached to the staff report. And that's one from, I think it's Jackie Heavey, which is a link to a Seattle Times article regarding commercialization of the Goonies house in Astoria. It's an email that was sent December 13th. The second one from Jackie Heavey, linked to a News at Northeastern article regarding when Airbnbs increase in a neighborhood, so does crime, and here's why. Also by email 12/13/2022. Francine Bulosa, and I may have messed up that name, request to hold the record open for a 7-day period to file written comments after the hearing. That was also 12/13/2022. The record's going to be held open as a result of that request, and we will talk about schedule of that after we do the public hearing, public testimony today. And then I received another one from Evan West, a comment on 795 Church Street Southeast that was emailed today. Is there anything else that I should have received that I've missed?
No, that's all that I'm aware of, Zach, unless you had got something separately from me.
Just for clarification, the testimony requesting that the record be left open, it appears to come from Francine. However, the signature is John Christensen. His computer is not working, and he was using acquaintances for, I don't know their relationship. Someone else he knows this computer, and so it appears to be from her. However, it is from John.
Okay, and I went to the email line rather than the signature line. Okay, so I have a few questions before we start public testimony. And let's start with the site obscuring fence or screen for the parking. Would that 6-foot fence go through historic design review?
It would not unless it was attached. If it was physically attached to the secondary facade of the structure, it would require a historic design review. But if it is not, it's exempt, but it does have to still meet the standards, which is 6 feet, and it has to be made of a material that was available at the time, the period of significance, which, wood would be, an example.
So, okay, that's helpful. Within the underlying residential district, sorry, I can't read my own handwriting. I'm looking at my note here and trying to, what would the residential, for a single unit residential structure, what are the off-street parking requirements?
It is 2.
It is 2.
It is 2, yes.
Is that based on number of bedrooms, or is that just strictly?
It's just it's a long-standing requirement that we've had ever since, I got here in 2002.
Yeah.
But I will note that, our recent amendments to implement House Bill 2001 for middle housing, there is no requirement off street for, duplexes up to 4plexes. So
yeah. And I know that the climate friendly stuff is probably just going to eliminate any mention of parking.
Minimums are going to be kind of going away.
Okay, and so I think I've got my own handwriting worked out here. How many residential structures are within the historic district?
Oh, geez, I don't, Mr. Bureau, I don't know
This
that
is
off the top of
just-
my head.
This is just,
We can research that. I can research that and get you a number for,
it sounds like the record is going to be, well, the record is going to be held open. And so whether that comes from you or from the neighborhood association, that's one of those questions that I think as people are talking about how this affects housing supply, maybe we even narrow it to housing supply within the historic district. If there's already one other conditionally approved short-term rental.
May I ask for a point of clarification just to,
Sure.
for context, because the area is kind of broken up into,
Mhm.
there's the area north of
North and
Mission
and
Street.
south, yeah.
And then let's see, it's taking, what's going on here? North of me. So are you looking at would you be looking for the entire number of units in the entire district, or just those ones that are north in the kind of the enclave of the district, north of Mission Street, this area up here? Or would all the way around?
Yeah, I'm probably more interested in the enclave to the north, but I can see a logic in this whole thing is, so I would say whatever is easiest for people to get to.
Okay.
And I can certainly take a look at the maps that are in the record and that show lot lines, and I can count those. But so I don't know that that's a critical thing. It's a thing of interest.
I have the answer for you, Jim. According to the SHPO database, we have 113 eligible resources in that and 32 ineligible resources in the Gady Hill Bushes Pasture Park district.
Well, that was fast. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach.
My other part of my job is the historic side, so I knew where to find it. I didn't know it off the top of my head, but I knew where to find it.
Well, I'm just about to ask if this structure is a contributing resource within the district. I think you said yes during the presentation.
It is, yes.
And then we have one. So the number I gave you, the 113, is eligible resources. They might not all be residential. One of the people in the room has said that there are 101 residential buildings specifically.
We'll let them testify if they're going to testify or provide it in writing. That'll work. I think that let people know that that's something I'm interested in. I think as I think about the discussion of the use of these residential structures for short-term rentals is, it's still a lodging use. I think I heard you say, yeah, but it's not a hotel. That it's somehow different from that. And I want to, we wouldn't be having this discussion except that the underlying zone does allow the short-term rental use as a conditional use. Is that?
It does. And as I mentioned in my presentation, there are two types of short-term rentals. There's a short-term rental, like we're discussing tonight, but then there's also the accessory short-term rental. So, had the dwelling unit been occupied by the operators and they lived there, then that would be an accessory short-term rental, and that would be allowed outright as a special use.
As a special use allowed outright.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then, but since the owners will not be residing in the unit, that requires a conditional use permit.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we've got everything into the record that ought to be in the record. I appreciate the staff report and the presentation. Let's go ahead and move to, don't go away because we might need you later tonight. So, but let's go ahead and move to the public testimony portion. The applicant, would you like to make a presentation? Again, that's going to be limited to 15 minutes, and I would remind the applicant that you have the burden of proof to show the approval criteria can be satisfied by the facts, and that opponents may rebut those facts. You'll also get the last word either in rebuttal or in final written argument. So is the applicant here, and would you like to make a presentation?
Hi, Jim.
Hi, how are you? Welcome.
I'm good. I'm Brandon. And Jim, maybe I don't know it sounds like the normal process to kind of go over the same standards that Bryce just went over. And I'm in
Brandon,
total agreement.
Just
Sorry,
real quick,
go
can you list your address for the record or business address?
295 Patterson Street Northwest in Salem, 97304.
Thank you. Go ahead and continue.
No problem. So as I was saying, I'm sure that normally, I don't really want to recite the same things that Bryce did. I'm in agreement with staff on this. I really would just like to say to people in the neighborhood here that I understand that you're concerned, and I just wanted to say that I'm local. My family's been here since 1988. I manage an Airbnb in West Salem right now. We haven't had any complaints from the neighbors, and I plan to do things above board. And I'd be happy to take any feedback from anybody if they feel there's ways that we can help mitigate things to make you guys feel better about this in the neighborhood. And if there's nothing, I completely understand, and I respect that you have an opinion on the matter because it's your neighborhood. But myself and Quinn, who's the other property owner, we plan to be attentive and respond quickly. And I'm happy to share my personal contact information with anybody in the neighborhood as well, if they need to get a hold of me. So that's really all I have to say.
Okay. As I said, you'll get an opportunity to rebut, assuming that we have testimony in opposition, and I think people have signed up in opposition. So.
Okay, and I would like to add one more thing. And this is, I know that today we're just talking about 795 Church Street. And I know that there's a lot of news articles, it sounds like Jacqueline, had sent in a couple news articles to Jim or to city staff regarding the Goonies house and different things. And there's a lot of talk about, Airbnb is just greed. And, the goal of the project, yes, is to make money. But myself, I'm involved in other land use decisions here in Salem. I'm just about finishing up 6 units in Northeast Salem on Winter Street that's going to be active for long-term renters only. I'm in partnership with somebody else where we're looking at doing over 20 residential units off of 12th Street near the train station. That's in site plan review at the moment. And I'm in the middle of doing an application for partitioning property in West Salem that would increase the maximum number of available units from 4 to 6. And so I'm not, you can look at this isolated one case and say, hey, this is just another evil developer coming in and trying to ruin the city just to make a buck. But I would hope that I would be looked at as a whole person, and that I'd be looked at for all the projects that I'm bringing to Salem. And it's typically underutilized pieces of property that have been vacant for 50 plus years. And I'm coming in and doing my own site plans and trying to make use of properties that are underutilized within the city. So thanks for having me. And anyways, I hope we can continue to keep the house beautiful in Bush Park. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you. And thank you for your brevity. We'll move things along. I would say, again, my decisions can be made on the criteria. None of the criteria go to who the owner is or anything else. And this is one of those things in our civic discourse that can really function well as people keep focused on that rather than, on personalities of any kind. So again, welcome, and we'll continue this process. Okay. With that, do we have anyone who wishes to speak in favor of the application?
We do have someone from the neighborhood first. If
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, neighborhood association, and I believe your time would be limited to 10 minutes.
Mhm.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can. Thank you, Evan. Welcome.
Excellent. Thank you. I appreciate that. My address for the record is 466 Rural Avenue South, 97302. I'm Evan West. In my professional capacity, I'm a historic preservation specialist. I hold a master's degree in public history and a graduate certificate in historic preservation from the University of Colorado, Denver. I bring to the Salem community 10 years of professional nationwide experience in historic preservation advocacy and compliance. Of equal importance is the fact that I'm a proud resident of Salem. I'm honored to be here this evening to represent my colleagues on the board of the South Central Association of Neighbors. I've also submitted to the hearing officer my own evidential testimony regarding the proposed conditional use permit from my unique perspective as a preservation professional. I stress the importance of evidence. SCAN has submitted evidence as required by ORS 197.763 that the proposed conditional use permit and Class 2 adjustment run counter to the city's strategic plan priorities of addressing homelessness and building great neighborhoods. And by this contravention, the application fails to demonstrate that the conditional use permit would cause only the minimum acceptable impact. By virtue of the evidential testimony presented tonight, SCAN has demonstrated and will demonstrate that the loss of even one long-term neighbor in the Gaiety Hill Bush Pasture Park National Historic District constitutes a significantly adverse effect on the livability of the neighborhood and does not support an end to the housing crisis in our city. SCAN opposes the proliferation of non-accessory short-term rental licenses in Salem, in part because of the adverse effect of this proliferation on the availability of long-term housing in our community. Salem is already experiencing a housing availability deficit, which is projected by the Salem Housing Needs Analysis, which is material evidence created by the city of Salem, to become worse if action is not taken. To date, the city has not satisfactorily demonstrated the ways in which the loss of housing to short-term rental is mitigated by other action. Multiple homeowners and long-term residents of the Gaiety Hill neighborhood have submitted written testimony to the city, and I suspect that more will be called on to speak to the issue tonight. The concerns raised repeatedly by residents, as demonstrated by written and spoken testimony, include the tacit sanctioning of, quote, hollow buildings, which short-term rentals become while they are unoccupied by renters. Concerns also include the persistent attempts of business to infiltrate and degrade the residential integrity of the neighborhood over many years, which has often gone largely unchecked by city regulators. And most importantly of all, the totality of the many abstruse yet profound adverse impacts to the community structure and social and cultural fabric of the neighborhood caused by the loss of long-term residents. These neighbors are pleading for the city to understand that the evidence of intangible impacts is presented in their daily lived experiences and that their evidential testimony dramatically outweighs the theoretical arguments presented in the staff report. We also asked the hearing officer to note that the staff report erroneously indicates that the previously existing short-term rental in the Gaiety Hill neighborhood was affirmed by City Council. In fact, the previous request of the neighborhood to City Council ended in a tied vote, leaving in place the hearing officer's decision, not explicitly affirming it. The staff report attempts to rebut SCAN's evidence with the argument that short-term rental is essentially the same as long-term residence, but this argument is not supported by evidence. Business lodging, including hotels, campgrounds, and yes, short-term rentals, collect the transient occupancy tax, which feeds the city's cultural and tourism fund. The facts are self-evident. To allow for the commercial use of the building would benefit the business owners and the city's tourism fund, but the city has not provided evidence that the residential livability will be minimally impacted. To the contrary, the staff report presents only the argument that conditions of the permit can ensure that peace and order will be maintained in the neighborhood. Although these are important factors, the staff report fails to address how compliance will be ensured, and these conditions fail to address the totality of livability, as demonstrated in the evidence previously submitted by SCAN. Furthermore, the staff report has failed to comprehend and to satisfactorily address the impact of the proposed permit on the National Historic District. The staff report speaks only to the most obvious concern, the physical condition of the building. The report fails to address the inherent adverse impact of the proposal to the integrity of the Gaiety Hill Bush Pasture Park National Historic District. Preservation professionals, such as I, evaluate resources based not only on eligibility criteria, but also critically on aspects of historic integrity. Integrity measures the ability of a historic resource to convey its significance. Categories of integrity include design, setting, association, and feeling. In a National Historic District, comprehensive integrity is even more critical. By legal definition, historic districts, quote, possess significant concentration, linkage, or continuity of buildings united historically or aesthetically by plan or physical development, unquote. The proposed change in use of 795 Church Street Southeast is a direct threat to both the continuity by plan of the historic district and also the integrity of feeling and association of the historic district, which is described as, quote, the feeling and sense of an early residential area in its streetscapes and architecture, unquote, by the 1986 National Historic District nomination document. In the evaluation of integrity, it is viewed as either present or absent. There is no middle ground. The Gaiety Hill Bush Pasture Park National Historic District currently continues to serve as an intact representation of the history of residential settlement in Oregon's capital city. But with every loss of integrity to contributing buildings, the totality of the district's integrity is further eroded and endangered. Specific to the physical building and the plot of 795 Church Street Southeast, which are items of even greater concern to the city ordinance, the expansion of parking to include a fenced or otherwise screened parking space facing Mission Street includes in the design proposal a fence of 6 feet in height on all sides. As identified by SRC 230.020, this constitutes a major impact to the integrity of the streetscape design because there is no differentiation at this location between side yard and front yard. It is my understanding that the height of the fence is subject to design review. SRC 230.082 directs that, quote, a public agency shall avoid inadvertent impacts to a historic resource for which the agency is responsible, unquote. By nature of this permit appearing before the Community Development Department, the city has demonstrated its responsibility for the issue at hand. The residents of Scan are imploring. As the hearing officer, you have both the authority and the obligation to take action to prevent wide-ranging, inadvertent, yet maximum adverse impact to the residential livability and cultural identity preserved and embodied by the National Historic District. We respectfully request that the conditional use permit be denied, and we respectfully request that the record of written evidence and testimony be kept open for an additional 7 days, as allowed for by ORS 197.765. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. I will add before that in answer to your question to Mr. Bishop, there are 101 residential buildings from the historic district period of significance identified in the National Historic District nomination. That concludes my comment.
Okay, and I'm going to ask a question on the last point, just because I can.
Please.
So those 101 contributing residential structures, are they all single family?
To my knowledge, the historic district was designed to embody single family residential historic structures.
Okay.
I'm not aware of any business or commercial use as fairly broadly identified that was
Okay.
a part of the original nomination. With the possible exception of the Bush House and Deepwood Estate, which are historic house museums.
Sure. Okay, that's a lot to take in. I took a lot of notes, which I may be able to read later or may not. Since the record is held open, may I ask if you have written that out?
Yes, this is all written down. I can send it to you if you would like to.
That would be very helpful in considering these things. So the record is going to be held open. We'll get to the calendaring of that as we get to the end of public testimony. But thank you. I appreciate in particular the references to SRC sections for consideration on the impact of the streetscape. That's very useful to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay. With that, we'll move on to general public testimony. Do we have anyone who would like to speak in favor of the application?
We did not have anyone sign up to speak in favor.
Then I'm going to say we don't have anyone who wants to do that. So we'll go ahead and move to testimony in opposition, and each person will get 5 minutes. And again, we'll ask you to give your name and address as other people have. And we do have, I think, a list of people. Maybe, is that the order you're going to take them in, Zachary?
And that was my thought, but if you want to go out in a different order, you are welcome to.
Yeah, I think that order, so we'd start with Carleen Benson. I see you. Can you unmute yourself maybe?
And then while we're waiting, just so you know, we do still have 2 people who have not shown up. Hopefully they do, but I'll let you know who they are as we get to them.
Okay. And after Carleen, we'll move to Mary Ann Spradlin. So welcome, Carleen. Are you going to be on camera too, or just audio?
Well, I did undo my camera, but I'm not seeing myself. So
I'm not seeing you either. You're a blank screen.
hang on just a minute. Okay. Maybe that'll do it. Okay, there I am.
Welcome.
Okay, having me go after Evan, it's kind of not fair.
Okay, so we're gonna use you as the model. If you again identify yourself and your address so that the recording picks it up, then everybody else will follow you.
Okay, my name is Carleen Benson. I live at 545 Leslie Street Southeast, and I'm around the corner from the subject property. I'm also around the corner from the other STR that the city allowed as an experiment and is now erroneously being used as a precedent. I'm very disappointed, and I'm really sad mostly that despite the many letters from people who live here, who know the neighborhood and its dynamics, every single point that we raised was discounted in by the city in the staff report. And yet the staff report does not prove that an STR will not severely impact this residential neighborhood. By accepting the historic district 40 years ago, the city also accepted the duty to protect, support, and strengthen it. And I don't see that happening here. And that's not been our experience. I've lost count of the number of times I've stood before hearing officers and city council to try to ward off yet another threat to this very, very fragile neighborhood. And we're just all worn out from it. The so-called criteria used to prove that this STR won't cause any impact on the residential character is very subjective. It's not measurable, and it's speculative. If you're going to use subjective measures, then why not use them to support the historic district, not weaken it, as the case is here? For instance, to compare visitors and vacationers with actual residents is, in my view, silly. We're not living the same lives as vacationers. We know each other here. We aren't strangers going in and out of a short-term rental, nor are we hosting a noisy party that runs until 3 a.m. and fills the street with cars and college students who don't belong in the neighborhood, as a neighbor reported to us last night. And that house has restrictions on parties as well. It seems that staff refuse to accept that transient visitors or empty houses have an impact on a neighborhood. Sleeping in a house does not make you a caring, involved resident of the neighborhood. And it weakens the very fabric of what we've worked so hard to achieve. The comment about, long-term renters and neighbors can be bad neighbors too. Well, sure, I'll tell you, it doesn't happen here hardly at all. But I would have more suspicion on a short-term renter who's here and gone. And, people have put up fences with that other house and locks with that other house, lock the gate because of that. The fact that a short-term rental takes a house out of available housing from people who actually want to live here and not just vacation here was disputed by the city in 2 long paragraphs, essentially saying, no worries, we've solved the housing shortage. I don't think so. A hotel is commercial use, even a small hotel. And Mr. Fallman, for you, you don't live here. You don't have any idea how fragile this neighborhood is. This is not an underutilized property, and you don't understand. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's see. And so we said, Mary Ann Spradlin, you're next. Welcome.
Right, there I am. I'm Mary Ann Spradlin. My current address is 1547 Chemeketa Street Northeast, which is in the Court Chemeketa Historic District. For 6 years previously, I lived at 712 High Street, which is in the Gaiety Hill Historic District and across the street from the current short-term rental. And I would request that this conditional use permit be denied. Evan said it all wonderfully, that there's a fabric of the neighborhood. And when you take a house away, you take away something that it's intangible. You can't get it back. And I can't tell you how proud I am of all of my neighbors and all the letters that they wrote and how much this neighborhood means to people. It's not like any other neighborhood in Salem, and it might not be like any other neighborhood in a lot of places. And it really is old-fashioned neighbors. And again, you can't measure it, but the impact of taking a house away and making it into a short-term rental is not a minimal impact. It is a big impact. And when you asked about the houses, there is a finite number, and several of them have already been lost. And I will provide written testimony about that to be very specific so that I can tell you which ones they are and what they're being used for. What else? I have notes. The use of the home as a motel is not anywhere near the use of the home as a residence. Those people are in and out. They don't care. They might not be actively terrible, but they don't care. And when Bryce said that, yeah, long-term neighbors can be bad too, not so much, not in our neighborhood. It's not like that. We care about each other. And when we sell our houses, we try real hard to sell them to people who will live there and be real neighbors because it's vitally important to us. So I think that's all I have to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And next, William, and I'm sorry, I'm going to mess this up, probably Bagged.
Hi, I'm William Vaught.
Welcome.
690 Liberty Street, Southeast. I'm in the historical district. Specifically, I'd like to address the 6-foot site obscuring fence that is required. This, as you notice by the photographs, this fence would fully face Mission Street, and as a corner lot, there's no break from the front to the side there. And so under the 230 code, front fences in front yards are limited to 4 feet. And so this is not, it should have been subject to review by the Historical Commission. It is not a side yard by any means. I think that's that they're trying to minimize the impact, because as you drive down Mission Street, the first thing you will see as you come into the historic district will be a 6-foot obscuring fence that will be out of character. The overall design for the historic district is anything new should enhance the overall character of the district, and a 6-foot privacy fence, I'm sorry, as the first thing you see as you come to the district is not an enhancement. I think this is just another point of how this is not a minimum impact. This is a major impact to the district, to its character, and to its people, and that cannot be mitigated away by conditions that are really non-compliant with historic review. I think that's my point. Please extend the written comment period by 7 days.
It will be.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. And looks like next is Jackie, is it Heavey?
Yes, it's Jackie Heavey. I don't know why my video's not working for some reason. Let's see. I'll try it again. It said the host isn't letting me. You cannot start your video because the host has stopped it.
Sorry, I will fix that. You had it on earlier when it was supposed to be off, and I turned it off. Let me.
Oh, okay. I don't need a video. It's not that.
Well, I think I just fixed it.
Oh, okay, let me try. Okay, great.
Welcome.
Hi. Thanks. Let's see here. So my name's Jackie Heavey. My family and I, we live at 747 Church Street. So we're 2 doors down from this house. Mr. Brewer, I appreciate that you asked about the size of the neighborhood. And I do think that's like a really critical piece in terms of consequences of this. It's small. I also just really want to thank Evan West for his representation tonight. Having an expert in historical preservation sharing his knowledge and support for this neighborhood is really important. And I just appreciate the professional perspective, and I hope the staff does as well. I'm just a lay person that lives here. So I'm going to tell you a little story. I'm, of course, just in bed last night, and I get a text on my phone from my neighbor. And Miss Sharon says, oh, it looks like the family settled in for the night. She's in her family room and she can see that we've left our Christmas tree on. So I'm laughing because literally if Miss Sharon had an open window from her family room, she could have reached through and like unplugged our tree. Like she's closer to it than we are in our bedroom. And my point is of that story is we're in old residential Salem. We have super small lots. We live super close together. I don't live next to an anonymous hotel guest. I live next to Miss Sharon. This very same afternoon today on the alley, my neighbor left their garage door open. And we all know in this neighborhood, a garage door left open for any amount of time, your stuff's probably gone. Not a problem. I know where they hide their garage door clicker in the garage, so I shut it. And I'm bringing this up to say that, you know, looking over the staff report, you're not really facing what an intact residential neighborhood is. The staff keeps saying like, oh, we're going to mitigate the major impacts on this teeny neighborhood of commercial lodging in a residential neighborhood by putting these conditions that it has to be like one group for a night, or you can't have more than 8 guests at a time. But I think the whole point is it's not a resident. It's not an owner or a renter. It's a short-term motel guest. Try as you may, you can't overcome the non-residential nature of the operation with these conditions you're putting on. It's just not consistent with the zone. In the staff report, they're admitting that this is a commercial enterprise. It's not residential in nature, but it's noted that the general characteristics of use are similar to those of a single family residential use, and that there are people living in the structure, albeit on a temporary basis. So sure, the people are living there and that they're breathing, they're living in a way we all would live in a motel. You don't unpack, you sleep, maybe you shower. So living does not make a resident. Someone living somewhere does not build a residential neighborhood. It's not compatible. To put it another way, I'm not telling the motel guest where my clicker is to shut my garage. In the report, it's also noted that it's okay to put a commercial entity in a residential neighborhood because the house is going to look residential in appearance. So apparently we've all signed up to live in a national residential historic district just for looks. So apparently I'm shallower than I thought. I have no idea like if the staff knows this area specifically, like this teeny neighborhood, or if you're heading down like Commercial Street, like towards the Roth South. But you see, like, I just looked at it today, like you look at all those well-kept, those older homes, they've got charm, they've got character. Most of them are now like dentist's office, lawyer's offices. Appearances don't make a neighborhood. No one would say that that's a neighborhood any longer because they're commercial entities. They're just commercial entities in a house. Stringing together old homes doesn't make a residential neighborhood. And I have no doubt that the applicant is going to maintain the exterior. They have a vested interest. Do you stay at a dumpy looking motel or one that's well kept? And again, the other point about the applicant resides in the area, that's not the point either. They don't reside in the house. So in my mind, I just picture like Swiss cheese. We keep blowing holes in the livability of this neighborhood. It won't hang together, as it's a tiny pressured neighborhood. The holes are going to dissolve away. And you just have to look at why other municipalities in Oregon, nationally, internationally, they've banned or significantly restricted Airbnbs in residential neighborhoods. They've read all the literature, they've read the studies, they've listened to the community. Like, we're here. And they have acted, and we're asking you to do the same. Thank you. And Mary Ann, I got teary when I was hearing you. Anyway, thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the written testimony too. What I'll say, the record is going to be held open for an additional at least 7 days for people to provide more things. If there are more things you want to provide me with, that's fine.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thanks.
Justin Wilhere.
Justin has not logged in. He's one of the two who have not.
Okay. How about Patricia Demina?
That was perfect. You got the pronunciation right on. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Welcome.
Am I loud enough?
You are pretty loud enough for me.
Okay, great, great. My name is Patricia Demina, and I live with my husband Roger at 635 Church Street Southeast. And what I have sought to do is to direct my remarks to criteria number 3, that use will be reasonably compatible and have minimal impact on the livability and appropriate development of the surrounding property. When the neighborhood suffers the loss of participation by personally invested community members, the neighborhood sustainability is threatened, and it renders a situation that is not in conformance with criteria number 3. And I and my husband, we are both opposed to granting the permit for the STR at 795 Church Street. This is just a little history, which a lot of the people who are here in attendance have heard before, but I just like to present it. I have a reason for it. The residents of Gaiety Hill almost 40 years ago made the decision to take the necessary steps to defend against commercialization of their neighborhood. Those steps entailed a 3-year process, followed by approval by City Council to create the Gaiety Hill Bushes Pasture Park Residential Historic District. When the neighbors defined the boundaries of the district, they intentionally excluded all commercial uses. Their goal then, as it is ours today, was to preserve the historic character of the district as a residential neighborhood. This proposed STR, and any STR, is a commercial use that the neighborhood has repeatedly made efforts to guard against. What I would really like to emphasize is that this effort to guard against commercialism did not happen recently, or even as a result of the STR ordinance. It might not carry the legal clout of a rule in a homeowners association, but this is a neighborhood that is on record, and we have been for decades. I would hope to see that our longtime record of opposition to commercialization be taken into consideration. Every house in our neighborhood, that is every residence, contributes to our neighborhood by participating in the life of the community. The tourists or business travelers who lodge for a few days do not participate in community life, nor will they, nor can they involve themselves in the preservation challenges that the neighborhood regularly faces. And I'd just like to mention a sampling of those kinds of challenges that we struggle with from time to time. When Salem Health wanted access onto Church Street from the blind school property, the neighbors successfully negotiated with the hospital. The hospital agreed not to pursue vehicle access onto a residential street. All of the west side of Church Street is residential and the east side is the hospital. And then we collaborated on a greenway buffer along the hospital's Church Street boundary. In 2014, when Salem Health purchased this same property at 795, the neighbors made their concerns known, and the property was eventually returned to the housing market. In 2018, there was a decision by the city to install 10-hour metered parking on Church Street that would have effectively blocked homeowners and their guests from parking there. The neighbors came forward again, and the decision was reversed. I'm pointing out these examples of commercial encroachment and the neighbors' response to it because Gaiety Hill is a small community of basically a few square blocks. It's that portion that is the northern end, and I believe it's about 50 homes total, Gaiety Hill, the Gaiety Hill portion of the historic district. The loss of one residence on High Street to an STR, and now we're facing the second, has an impact on the community's ability to sustain itself. We feel that every house, every residence is important to maintaining the integrity of our residential historic district. And with that in mind, I request that the permit for this STR be denied.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate reference to criteria. It's very useful.
I hope so.
Okay. Colleen Van Driel.
Hello, I submitted written testimony, so I don't care to speak.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let's see. Then I go to Andrea Faust.
Andrea is the other person who has not logged in yet.
Okay. How about Wally Benson?
I'm here.
Welcome.
And now
There
you
you
can
are.
see me with the whirly bird over my head. After hearing Evan and my wife talk, I really didn't have a whole lot to say except to echo what they had said. But you know, the things that Carlene touched on about the neighbor to the existing short-term rental, they had a fence between them and the gate was always open because the person who lived there, they all knew each other. Well, now that gate is locked. So there are real effects on this neighborhood. But I also wanted to echo what Evan said about the evidence. We don't see any evidence from the city staff that it won't affect our district. In fact, we have evidence that it will not. It's opinion and supposition, and I don't agree with it. So, but again, other people have touched on a lot I was going to say, so I'll just keep it brief, and thank you for your time.
Well, thank you for your time.
And then Wally, just for the record, I want to double check that you are also at the same address as Carlene.
As far as I know, yeah.
Wonderful.
And Mary Fitzpatrick, I think you're next.
Mary Fitzpatrick at 685 Church Street Southeast, 1 block north of the house in question. And my husband and I have already submitted written testimony, so I don't have too much to add, just to so much good testimony has already been given, but we are definitely in opposition to granting this conditional use permit for a basically completely commercial purposes in a residential neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you. That is who I have on the list. Do we have anybody else, Zachary?
We do not. So we don't have anyone for neutral testimony either.
Okay. And would the applicant like to rebut any of the testimony?
Hi, Jim.
Hi, Brandon.
The only thing I'd like to talk about is the fencing. And specifically looking at Salem Revised Code 230.020, letter A, number 2, letter F. It talks about fencing within the historic design review. I'm just going to read it real quick. The addition of fencing to the site of a local historic resource or contributing or non-contributing resource in a local or national register historic district, provided the fencing is not attached to any primary or secondary resource on the site, is of wood or metal, and does not exceed 4 feet in height within the front yard and 6 feet in height within the side and rear yards. So I just wanted to point to that specific code language. And then I'm going to move over to lot line designations in SRC 800.020, letter A, number 2. I'm going to read that off. So designation of lot lines, front lot line. The front lot line shall be designated as set forth in the subsection. And then number 2 says for corner lot, the front lot line shall be the property line abutting a street designated by the building permit applicant. So with this property being labeled 795 Church Street with the front door facing Church Street, I think we can reasonably assume the applicant at the time when they applied for the building permit were using Church Street as a front lot line. So we can assume that Mission Street on this corner is the side yard, and then we would meet the exemption from a historic design review in that side yard. I do want to add, like, I'm open if there's anybody within the neighborhood that wants to discuss an alternative option for fencing and something that we can talk to staff about and see if we can come to a mutual agreement. I'm open to discussing that. I'm also open to discussing different designs for the fence. At the moment, it just has to be wood or metal or a combination. And if there's something that, Evan, if you want to talk to me about what would have been historically appropriate at that time, I'm happy to sit down, talk to you about it, and see if we can find something that would work for everybody. And that's all I have to say. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so we have some calendaring to do. And Bryce, if you're up,
yes.
let's look at calendars together. We've had a request to have the record held open. So what we would typically do is hold the record open for a week, then have a week for people to rebut that material. And then again, because the applicant has the last word, they get an opportunity for final written argument. That's not to be new evidence, but just a kind of final word on things. And we would normally give people a week for that as well. Looking at the calendar across the room from where I'm sitting, that would look like 5 o'clock on the 21st.
Correct.
Then 5 o'clock on the 28th.
Yes.
And I think 5 o'clock on January 4th for the final written argument.
Those are correct dates and times, yes.
So that's the schedule that we'll be on. I'm not going to make a decision. The record will be open. If you do have questions about that calendaring, then Bryce would be the correct person to contact. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So with that, this hearing is closed, and it'll be deferred for some weeks. And I do encourage people again, with your written comments, the closer you can tie them to criteria, the more useful it is for me to know where these things are supposed to fit. So I would like to thank everybody who participated. It is an important part of the process to do that. So we're going to move to the third hearing. And of course, everyone is welcome to stay, but you don't have to, as we talk about a subdivision and some other things. So it is now 7:13. I'm still Jim Brewer. I'm still the hearings officer. I'm still going to outline the hearing procedure, although I think the applicant is the only person here for this.
That is correct. It's actually the applicant's representative, but
yeah.
Same.
Again, testimony from neighborhood organizations, people in favor and opposition. It's going to be limited to those who signed in before 3 p.m. and nobody did. The order of tonight's proceedings, since we don't have anybody signed in, will be a staff report to be presented by Bryce Bishop. The applicant's presentation, and you're being limited to 15 minutes, Brandy. We won't have a neighborhood report, and we don't have anybody who's signed in to give testimony, which means you won't get a chance to rebut. At the end of that, unless you ask to have the record held open, we'll close the public hearing. Want to direct your attention to the applicable criteria found in the notice. The testimony and evidence for the public hearing must be directed towards those criteria. Brandy, I am going to ask you, do you want me to read through the criteria, or are you aware of what they are since you've seen the staff report?
I'm well aware of what the criteria is, so there's no need.
Okay, then I am going to assume that everyone will be comfortable waiving the reading of the criteria, but it is useful to have people do that. I will say failure to raise an issue accompanied by statements or evidence sufficient to afford the city or other parties the opportunity to respond to the issue will preclude appeal to the State Land Use Board of Appeals based on that issue. So there is a point you want to bring up. This is the time and place to do it, or you won't be able to later. And failure of the applicant to raise constitutional or other issues related to the proposed conditions of approval with sufficient specificity to allow the local government or its designee to respond to the issue precludes an action for damages in circuit court. So if you don't like any of the conditions, it's the time to bring that up. Are there any objections on jurisdictional grounds of holding of this hearing, meaning it's not the sort of thing supposed to be in front of a hearings officer? Not seeing any. So this is CU-SUB-ADJ-DAP 22-05 1300 block of Mildred Lane Southeast, Salem, Oregon. And could we have the staff report, Mr. Bishop?
Yes, thank you again, Mr. Brewer. Bryce Bishop with the City of Salem Planning Division, and here to present the staff report for this combined or consolidated conditional use permit, Class 2 adjustment, Class 2 driveway, and Class 2 driveway approach permit for property in the 1300 block of Mildred Lane. I will go ahead and have these entered into the record, the staff report in the presentation. So there's that. But in terms of background, this is again a consolidated case for a conditional use permit subdivision, Class 2 adjustment, and a Class 2 driveway approach permit. The conditional use permit aspect of this is very limited due to the zoning of the property, a portion of which is IC, which requires a conditional use permit for single family dwellings in the IC zone. The Class 2 adjustment has 4 components. The first component is to increase the maximum number of flag lots allowed in the subdivision. The maximum is 15%. The applicant is, looking to request, more than the maximum number of flag lots to designate. Not design, but to designate the south property line of Lot 1 as the front rather than the property line abutting Mildred Lane. The third adjustment is to allow single-family dwellings constructed in a subdivision to access a minor arterial street. And the fourth and final adjustment is to reduce the minimum required driveway spacing for the proposed flag lot access way onto Mildred to reduce the spacing between the access way onto the street and Marstone Court to the south, which is a public street. And then there's also a driveway approach permit for the flag lot access way under Mildred Lane. So in terms of the subject property, it's located at the kind of on the curve of Mildred Lane west of Woodside. So it's at the corner of Woodside Drive southeast and Mildred Lane. Commercial Street is over off to the east. And then there's a shopping center, which includes Safeway, further to the east on the east side of Commercial Street. It's located in an area that's kind of a mixture of, storage, businesses, many single family homes, and developing residential properties, such as to the northwest. We have proposals for further development in those areas as well. In terms of the zoning of the property, it is split zoned, IC, industrial commercial, and RA, residential agriculture. And it is zoned also, or it is designated also industrial commercial on the Salem Area Comprehensive Plan map and zoned industrial commercial. So in terms of looking at the site conditions, the site is a 1.71 acre property. It's bisected by Wallen Creek. The east half of the property was approved previously through a conditional use permit and site plan review approval for a 24-unit multifamily development, as can be seen on this 2021 aerial photo. That construction of that 24-unit multifamily development is underway with foundation, and then the western side of the property is proposed for 3 lots that will be developed with single-family dwellings. Looking at the topography of the site, it is generally flat, except for when you get next to Wallen Creek, where you have the channel of the creek. Topography increases a bit, and within that creek bed area, there are mapped 2 landslide hazard susceptibility point areas, which are the green areas shown here. Geological assessment wasn't required with this proposed subdivision because development will not be occurring in the area of mapped landslide hazard susceptibility, and therefore there is no risk. And there are also wetlands and hydric soils present. The wetland is associated obviously with the riparian corridor of Wallen Creek, and there are some mapped hydric soils. Any development of the property is required to comply with the requirements of DSL and the Army Corps of Engineers, and that will be would be required for future development of the property. In terms of looking at the site context, in terms of area photos, this is a photograph taken from Google. It's at the intersection of Woodside and Mildred, looking to the southwest. This would be the portion of the site that is currently under construction is for multifamily, the 24-unit multifamily development. And then when you jump across to the west side of Wallen Creek, you have the western portion of the subject property that is proposed to be developed with the 3 single-family dwellings. The riparian corridor of the creek with existing trees is along the left-hand side or the east side of the property. And then you can see single-family homes that exist to the south of the subject property. So in terms of the proposed layout of the subdivision, you have 4 proposed lots, 1 large lot to accommodate the existing or the multifamily development that was previously approved in 2020 through conditional use site plan review, driveway approach permit, design review, case number 2006. And then you have the 3 proposed lots on the west side of Wallen Creek. They will be served by a flag lot access way with a turnaround onto Mildred Lane. And 2 of the proposed lots are flag lots, that don't have frontage on a street. Those are lots 2 and 3. Lot 1 within the subdivision is not a flag lot because it has frontage on a street, but it will take access because of the classification of Mildred Lane as a minor arterial. It will take access consolidated with the other 2 lots to the east via this flag lot access way. So in terms of the adjustments, the applicant has requested, 1 adjustment to the overall number of flag lots in the subdivision based on the 15% standard maximum. Out of 4 lots proposed, you'd only be able to have 1 flag lot within the subdivision. There are 2, so they're increasing, the number of flag lots allowed at a maximum by 1. They're also requesting to designate the south line of lot 1 as the front lot line for building setback purposes, as opposed to the normal front lot line, which would be the lot line adjacent to the street, in this case Mildred. And then the 3rd adjustment that's being requested is to allow the 3 homes that will be built on these 3 lots to have access to Mildred Lane via the flag lot access way. And then the 4th one is to reduce the spacing from the flag lot access way to Marstone Court to the south. And so if you look here, so in terms of this aerial photo, the flag lot access way comes in along the southern property line of the property abutting the homes to the south. And so the normal minimum spacing between a driveway and a street or another driveway, either of those, another street or a driveway, is 370. The spacing is less than that, so the applicants have requested an adjustment to that minimum spacing requirement. So in terms of the conditional use permit, the conditional use permit only applies to the portions of the site that are zoned. Let me jump back here, that are zoned IC, industrial commercial. And so when you look at the site, the only portion that is zoned IC that will be developed for single family is the small triangle area to the southeast corner of the property on the west side of Waln Creek. So these lots, they're not entirely zoned IC, but they will have portions of them which are zoned IC. And because of that, an adjustment to, or a conditional use permit is required. Because they will be split zoned RA and IC, they need the conditional use permit. The single family dwellings are conditional or are consistent with the single family dwellings in the surrounding neighborhood to the north and the south and to the west, and they will not have an impact based on the use, and the adjacent uses to the surrounding area, and therefore there are really no need for conditions to minimize the impacts of these single family homes on the surrounding neighborhood because they will be consistent with the surrounding neighborhood. Single family is allowed as a conditional use, in the zone, so therefore it meets the first criterion, and the single family dwellings will not be incompatible with or impact the livability or appropriate development of the surrounding area. So the findings addressing that are included in the staff report, and we recommend approval of the conditional use permit. In terms of the subdivision, it was reviewed for all of the applicable standards of the subdivision code, which is chapter 205 and the RS zone and the IC zone. The reason I reference RS zone here is because our code provides that if you have RA zone land that is subject to a subdivision plat, the RA zone land will automatically be rezoned to single family residential RS upon the recording of the plat. So even though the western portion of the property is zoned RA today, once the subdivision plat is recorded, it will become, RS, and therefore any development, on those lots will be subject to the RS zone. So in terms of lot standards and setbacks and everything else that applies to the subdivision, the proposed development conforms to the RS zone standards, the IC zone standards, and as identified in the staff report, it applies to all other applicable standards of the city's Unified Development Code. There are several conditions of approval that are included in the decision that require appropriate infrastructure for portions of street improvements or boundary street improvements and other infrastructure requirements for water, sewer to provide service to the lots. Those are included within the conditions of approval. And with those conditions, the proposed subdivision meets the approval criteria of chapter 205 or land division code. In terms of the class 2 adjustment and the class 2 driveway approach permit, in the staff report, we've identified how all 4 adjustments equally meet the underlying purpose of the standard that is being adjusted. In terms of the driveway approach permit, the siting of the driveway is really limited in this context because you have Waln Creek to the east, which makes it difficult to provide any east-west connectivity and avoid a separate driveway onto Mildred. I guess you could theoretically have another crossing of the creek just to the to the south of the existing Mildred Lane crossing, but that would have impacts to the riparian corridor and the vegetation and trees in the riparian corridor, and it would have to go through the multifamily development to the east. So based on the location of the property, where there is no connectivity to the south for streets because it's fully developed, and the creek, it really limits the western portion of the property to have some type of access to Mildred. The applicants did a site analysis study with the subdivision, and based on that study, at the very it's attached to the staff report, but the very final element of that is a drawing that shows their site distance analysis, where there's a recommendation that there be a height limit of structures to ensure that anything on any fencing or any structures built on the property will not impede vision clearance as you leave the flag lot accessway driveway and you're looking to the northeast. The limit on the height of structures in this area ensures vision clearance and safety, and so with the condition of approval that's included, that there be a site easement, a vision clearance easement dedicated on the property. It ensures that access to the property will be safe, and it equally meets the intent of the standard. And then based on the location of the driveway, based on the curve, it has to be essentially located in this area, in terms of maximizing visibility from the northeast and the southwest. So really, based on the analysis included in the staff report, and it's found that the only feasible point of access to the property is from this driveway here. And so there is kind of very limited in terms of where access can be taken, and the development is taking access from that location. The property is within the South Gateway Neighborhood Association. No comments were received from the Cigna Neighborhood Association, and there were no public comments received either. So with that, staff is going to conclude the presentation, and we recommend that the conditional use permit, subdivision, class 2 adjustment, class 2 driveway approach permit be approved, subject to the recommended conditions of approval in the staff report.
It's a pretty complicated 4-lot subdivision.
Yeah, it is.
That the curve along there and the creek both create some challenges. Thank you. Ms. Dalton, would you like to make a presentation? You have 15 minutes.
Yes, I won't need 15 minutes, but my name is Brandy Dalton. I'm land use consultant with Multi-Tech Engineering. We're located at 1155 Southeast 13th Street, Salem, Oregon, 97302. Bryce did a thorough job summarizing the application, so I'm not going to bore you with all that since all my findings are within the record. And this is a complex 4-lot subdivision, and we've been working with Bryce on this I really think over a year now. So we've got everything ironed out. We meet all the criteria. And I believe we satisfy everything the city was looking for. Really, the only 2 things I want to mention is one, last week, Mark Grins from our office attended the South Gateway Neighborhood Association on my behalf, and he was able to answer any questions and address any concerns they might have. Being that they didn't submit a letter, the neighborhood meeting must have gone well. And then the last thing is we did go over the conditions of approval, and we don't have any problem with them. They're all what's expected, and working with the city and everything. That's what we were looking to see. So with that, really, I'm here to answer any questions.
You know, it is very thorough. It's very detailed. I'm going to go with the staff recommendation on this, as one might expect. Appreciate your participation tonight and your patience. As we had a fairly long meeting for. So thank you.
Yep, thank you.
It'll take probably a week, 10 days to get the written decision out. So.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else tonight, Zachary?
I just want to confirm that the applicant is waiving their right to final written argument.
Yes, we're waiving our right.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Then that is everything on the agenda.
Okay. Thank you for your time tonight, Zachary and Bryce, and Laurel. I know you've stuck with us the whole way. So good night, and have good holidays.
Yes, you as well. Okay, bye-bye.
And